Okay, I wanted to go real quick over the quick acid ratio test. You will find this in your book in the chapter on short-term investments. It's important, obviously, that you read the chapters. We cover some of this in class, but some of this stuff we don't cover because we focus on some of the more difficult concepts. But looking at the book, one of the things I want to point out to you, because the quick acid test, sometimes it's called the quick ratio, the acid test ratio, but generally speaking, remember we talked last time for the previous test, we were talking about the current ratio. I won't spell it out, but it was the current, C-U-R-R-E-N-T. It was the current ratio. And the current ratio, if you'll remember, was current assets over current liabilities. Okay, so it was kind of a cousin of the quick ratio that we're about to talk about. The current ratio that we talked about previously, it basically encompasses more in the numerator on top. The quick acid test ratio, or the quick ratio as some people call it, one of the significant things that it ignores is inventory. Inventory is a current asset, but it is ignored by the quick acid ratio test. So cash is pretty self-explanatory that it would be in the quick acid ratio test. Most people know what cash is. Let's skip cash equivalents for a second. Short-term investments, this is pretty clear. We talked about investment in trading securities, that kind of stuff. And then net current receivables, this is the accounts receivables that we expect to collect. And then, of course, total current liabilities is anything that we owe in the next year. But let's talk about this cash equivalents for a second, because this has a tendency to trip people up. The best way to talk about cash equivalents is to look at an example. So let's say, for example, we have cash of $5 million, and then we have short-term investments of $10 million, accounts receivable of $15 million, inventories of $20 million. Now remember, I just said inventories does not go up here. Inventories is a current asset. It is a function. It does involve the current ratio, but we're not talking about the current ratio. We're talking about the quick ratio. So inventory won't be party to this. It's a distractor. And then we have prepaid rent. Prepaid rent, for example, any kind of prepaid expense is considered a cash equivalent. So for purposes of the quick ratio, prepaid expenses of any kind are part of what goes in the numerator for the quick ratio. Of course, here, let's see, we have salaries payable of $5 million and accounts payable of $19 million. Now, if you had, for example, I don't know, mortgage payable, if I can type, I don't know, $200 million. Okay, well, if you are going to owe $200 million way in the future, in 30 years, 15 years, this would not be part of the quick ratio. The quick ratio is not about long-term liabilities. It's not about notes payables that are out there. It's not about mortgage payables that are out there. It's strictly focused on short-term current liabilities and super short-term assets, current assets. It's so short-term that it ignores and says inventory cannot easily be turned into cash. So anyway, now we have it set up. And what I want to try to do is show you with this example what you would do to calculate the quick ratio. So we'll go to the solution. You notice we put, by the way, I got rid of all the millions. Since these are all in millions and we're working with fractions, you don't really need the millions. Notice that we put in cash $5 million, and then we put in short-term investments of the $10 million. That's also considered a cash equivalent. Accounts receivable of $15 million, we put that in. And we put in prepaid rent of $1 million. Notice we skipped, right? We did not include inventories because the quick ratio does not include inventories. So don't put inventories in the numerator. And then the denominator is pretty easy. Salaries payable, you would expect to pay that in the next year. Accounts payable, you expect to pay that in the next year. Accounts payable, actually, the next 30 days. And then that goes in the bottom, the 5 and the 19. And that gives you a quick ratio of 1.29. If you were given all this data and told to calculate the current ratio, the CURRENT ratio, not the quick ratio. Very easy. It'd be exactly the same, but you would add inventory. Inventory would be in the numerator. Wanted to go through this. It's important, like I said, you go through the textbook and get comfortable with the ratios that are in this chapter. I believe it's chapter 5. But I did want to go through this because this does tend to trip people up. They don't know what goes in the top. And when you look at the book here, I don't know if it does. It doesn't really specify. To me, it's not clear enough that inventory is not considered a cash equivalent. What is considered a cash equivalent in the example we just worked is, for example, short-term investments. Well, let me see. Get back. They have a category for short-term investments. So you got short-term investments, current receivables, and then prepaid rent, for example, is considered a cash equivalent. Practice this so that you know how the quick ratio works. The quick ratio, you would expect it to be lower because it's going to have a lower numerator than, for example, the current ratio. So it's going to have this missing. Anyway, I did want to point this out. If you look at the chapter, it does a fair job of covering it. I just want to make sure that you understood that inventory is not a cash equivalent. Hope you found this useful.